let's talk about the politics of the dopamine mythos. There are two major players that I see spreading this dopamine mythos. One is Anna Lembke, a Stanford psychiatrist who wrote the book Dopamine Nation that came out last year, and her colleague at Stanford, Andrew Huberman, a neuroscientist who has maybe the most popular health and self-improvement podcast right now and loves to talk about dopamine.
If anyone out there is feeling underwhelmed and kind of like life is no good, etc., chances are your dopamine system has been pushed too hard.
I think it's really important to look at where these two professionals are coming from. Huberman was born and raised in Palo Alto and has his own lab at Stanford, and Lembke runs Stanford's addiction medicine clinic. Her book is based around case studies of her patients, and two of her main characters are wealthy men who work in Silicon Valley. Palo Alto, the suburb of San Francisco where Stanford is located, was built by Leland Stanford in the 1800s when he was trying to move his family away from the workers who were protesting outside of his house. Stanford was obsessed with racehorses, and he developed something called the Palo Alto system.
Leland Stanford and Charles Marvin, his head horse trainer, were looking for a new way to train the youngest, fastest horses in the world. And this is how Palo Alto really starts, is as a horse stock farm. And that Palo Alto system, where they're applying new kinds of science and profit-directed tools to create life and monitor the production of life, underlies Palo Alto, even if people don't know that history.
Led by infamous eugenicist David Starr Jordan, Stanford University became a West Coast center for eugenics. They were obsessed with figuring out how to optimize the population and identify people who had good genes. Malcolm Harris actually says in this interview that if you go to Stanford now, you'll see a bunch of really tall people because being tall was supposed to be a mark of good genes. And in the 50s, the college had to special order 7-foot beds for their incoming freshmen because they were selecting for height. Anyway, this is where the modern IQ test comes from, the Stanford Binet intelligence test. It was a way to identify human potential at a young age and optimize human beings in much the same way Leland Stanford did with his baby racehorses. Through a critical disability lens, I see the word optimize as pretty much always a red flag, marking deeper eugenic roots. Optimization is always about getting the most profit and productivity out of your workers. In the early 20th century, this optimization was top-down. Organizational psychologists researched ways that managers could impose this on their workers. But since the 1980s, when Reagan and Thatcher shifted government policy toward individual responsibility by deregulating industries and cutting social safety nets, sometimes called neoliberal austerity, pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, we've been encouraged to internalize the striving for optimization and do it to ourselves in order to keep up in the workforce. Enter Dopamine Nation. Anna Lembke's book is essentially a thinly veiled rehash of the Protestant work ethic for the neuroscience age. And I know this because she's done a ton of interviews with Christian pastors where she basically admits it.
Of course, the Bible talks about the morality of all of this, and that's essential. And of course, through the lens of religion, that's how we understand what we are now understanding through neuroscience. They're converging and coming together.
Her book demonizes pleasure and valorizes suffering. Lembke suggests that we've become too soft now, and she wonders why, in a country where we have everything we need, we're still so sick and depressed. And her answer to that question is that we've been devouring ourselves, getting too much instant gratification without having to work for it. Huberman has made similar claims. Here he is having a good old time with Jordan Peterson.
One of the absolutely pathologic situations for any animal or human is to be able to access repeated dopamine surges without effort.
No sacrifice.
No sacrifice.
I disagree entirely with this thesis. I think it's really out of touch. Overconsumption is not a personal problem. It's literally just how a capitalist system works. And a lot of people in this country do not have everything they need. But I think Huberman and Lembke's position in one of the richest cities in the US may be skewing their perspectives on this. Palo Alto also has one of the highest youth rates in the country, and while Huberman and Lembke might attribute this to dopamine overload.
Yeah, the children of very wealthy people who are overindulged, I've seen that many times, many times, and it is a very sad sight.
Yeah, well, they're not optimally deprived, eh?
A less cruel explanation is that these Palo Alto kids are under immense pressure for high-octane achievement, which makes a lot of sense considering they live in the shadow of a university that, for the last century, has treated children like a prized stock of racehorses. This kind of stress to achieve, or even just to make enough money to survive, which we're all under to varying degrees, is something that people want to dissociate from. So we do drugs and we binge Netflix and we play video games and we scroll on TikTok. That's literally why these entertainment industries exist and make so much money. They are a cope. A 2016 paper on the structural reasons people in low-income neighborhoods struggle with gambling notes that it represents one of the few actions they can take to address the lack of opportunities and freedoms that they experience. I think what they're calling dopaminergic behaviors have a lot less to do with pleasure seeking and more to do with trying to dissociate from unpleasant social realities. But if you want to get workers to motivate themselves to generate more value and not get mad about their own exploitation, a really great way to do that is to tell them a scientific story about how these behaviors are chemical problems in their individual brains. And the best way to deal with them is not to regulate corporations or give people more social services or change the system in any way, but to learn resilience and regulate themselves.